Welcome to Soft Spoken Nights, a place where words slow down and stories become gentle enough to fall asleep to. Tonight's story is based on truth. It happened more than 2,000 years ago on a quiet night in ancient Athens when a man named Socrates waited calmly for his final hour. If you find peace in stories like this, if they help your mind rest, you can stay close by subscribing to Soft Spoken Nights. There are more tales waiting for you, stories about silence, wisdom, and the art of letting go. Now let us begin. The night was still. Athens slept beneath a pale moon, its narrow streets empty, the voices of the day replaced by the hush of distant waves. A soft wind passed through the prison yard, carrying with it the smell of olive trees and stone. Inside, a single lamp burned low. Socrates sat quietly on a small bench, his hands resting in his lap. The light flickered over his face, a face marked not by fear, but by a calm that came from knowing his life had already been lived fully. His hair was white now, his beard thin and silver in the dim glow. He looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, as though even in this small cell he could see the stars above. Outside the door, footsteps approached. The guard's voice was soft, respectful. "Your friend is here," he whispered. Crito entered, his face pale in the lamplight. He had not slept. He had spent the night arranging everything: the bribe, the boat, the escape. All Socrates had to do was agree. "My dear Socrates," he said, his voice trembling, "the ship from Delos will return tomorrow. You know what that means. But there is still time. Everything is ready. We can leave tonight." Socrates turned his head slightly, a faint smile forming. "You have always been loyal, Crito, always kind. But tell me, do you believe it is right to escape?" Crito frowned, his hands shaking. "Right? My friend, they are going to kill you." "Yes," Socrates said softly, "but would it be just?" The question hung in the air like a stone in water. Crito tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had known Socrates long enough to recognize this tone, the quiet certainty that came when the philosopher spoke not from fear, but from conviction. Socrates continued, "If one has spent his life obeying the laws of the city, living under their protection, can he then, at the end, disobey them because they no longer serve him? Would that not be the same as harming the very thing that nurtured him?" Crito shook his head. "But the city wronged you." "Perhaps," Socrates said, "but does the wrong of others justify our own?" He looked down at his hands, old, steady, familiar. "These hands have touched stone, written words, yes, lifted cups. They will soon hold the hemlock, and I am at peace with that. The laws of Athens are harsh, but they are ours. If I break them now, what lesson would I leave behind?" The silence deepened. The lamp crackled softly. Crito lowered his eyes, the weight of the words pressing against his heart. "I only wish to save you," he whispered. Socrates smiled again. "And I wish to save the truth." Outside, the wind rose and then faded. The city remained asleep, unaware of the quiet debate unfolding within its walls. Socrates leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. "Do not grieve for me, Crito. Death is not to be feared by those who have lived with purpose. We fear it only because we think it ends us. But perhaps it simply changes the form of what we are." Crito's eyes filled with tears. "You speak of death as if it were nothing." "Not nothing," Socrates said gently, "but nothing to be ashamed of. You see, philosophy, all these years, has been nothing but a rehearsal for this night. He looked toward the small barred window, where a line of moonlight touched the floor. The sound of an owl echoed faintly from somewhere beyond the walls. Tomorrow, he said, the body will die, but the soul will go where it is meant to go. If the soul is immortal, as I believe, then death is not destruction, it is release. He reached out and placed a hand on Credo's arm. You have done enough, my friend. Now let us talk of something gentler, of the sunrise, perhaps, or of the way the air feels before morning. Credo nodded, wiping his eyes, and so they sat together in silence, two old friends waiting for dawn. Socrates spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. You know, when I was a young man, I believed wisdom meant knowing much. Now I see it as something simpler. It is knowing that we know very little, and yet loving the search anyway. The guard passed once more, glancing in quietly, his face lit by the faint glow of the lamp. He lingered for a moment, then turned away. Even he could not bring himself to disturb the stillness of that room. Hours passed. The night grew colder, the lamp smaller, but within the prison walls there was peace. Socrates spoke softly now, not as a teacher, but as a man speaking to the stillness within himself. He remembered the marketplace, the laughter of his students, the scent of olive oil and dust, the sound of children chasing each other across the square. He thought of his wife, Xanthip, and of his sons, sleeping somewhere under the same sky. He did not wish for more time, only for the wisdom to use what little was left well. Dawn approached without hurry. The first hint of light touched the rim of the sky, and the city turned in its sleep. Somewhere a rooster called, then fell silent again, and the lamp in the cell burned on, a small star that refused to fade. The door opened softly. Phaedo entered first, his eyes heavy from a night without rest, his heart full and unsteady. Behind him came Simmias and Sabes, thoughtful and grave, then Apollodorus, already weeping though nothing had yet happened. They stood for a moment, unsure whether to speak. Socrates looked up and smiled as if he had been expecting morning to arrive inside their faces. My friends, he said, you bring the sun with you. They laughed a little through their sadness, and the room felt warmer. Crito rose to greet them and stepped aside. Socrates asked after each of them, not as a ritual, but as if kindness itself were a philosophy. Only when everyone had found a place along the wall did he speak again. We have time, he said simply. Let us use it well. The words calmed the air. Even Apollodorus, whose grief ran ahead of him like a child, grew quieter. Simmias looked at the floor. We have come for you, he said. But perhaps we have come for ourselves too. We want to understand how you can be so calm when the city has chosen what it has chosen. Socrates folded his hands. I am calm, he said, because I have practiced being calm. A lifetime is a lesson, and this... He glanced at the light creeping toward the threshold. This is the final chapter, not the first. Phaedo's voice was careful, tender. You have often said the philosopher spends his life learning how to die. Many have misunderstood you for that. Would you explain it again, slowly? Socrates nodded. To live as a philosopher, he began, is to learn to separate the soul from the noise that clings to it, not to treat the body with contempt, but to recognize that truth is easiest to see when desire is quiet and fear is sleeping. If the soul is most itself when it is least disturbed, then death, which releases it from the weight of sensation and appetite, may not be an evil at all. It may be a homecoming. Sabes listened with eyes narrowed, like a carpenter measuring a line twice before cutting once. But how, he said, can we be sure the soul survives? We love you, Socrates, but love is not proof. True, Socrates replied, so let us think together. He paused as if to make room for the thought before it arrived. Have you noticed how many things in the world are born from their opposites? Wakefulness from sleep, courage from facing fear, understanding from confusion. Night yields to day, and day returns to night. If living and dying are paired like light and shadow, should we be surprised if life arises from death as surely as waking rises from sleep? Semius nodded, then weighed the idea in silence. But an argument of opposites can be a ring that charms the ear, he said at last, and yet not hold the weight we place upon it. Then let us add weight, Socrates answered gently. Do you remember how we learn? When a child sees two equal sticks, he recognizes equality, yet he has never seen equality itself. He has seen only approximations, never the pure idea. And still, he knows what equality should be. So where did that knowledge come from, if not from the soul remembering what it knew before it wore a body? When we learn, we recollect. When we recognize, we remember. The soul, therefore, existed before birth, and if before, why not after? Phaedo felt his breath slow. There was nothing aggressive in the reasoning. It unfolded like a path that had been there all along waiting for footprints. Sabes still frowned, but with respect. Suppose the soul existed before, he said. Could it not be like the tune that depends on the lyre, beautiful while the instrument holds together, gone when the strings snap? Apollodorus flinched and put a hand to his mouth. Socrates turned toward Sabes with affection, as if praising a student for the courage to ask a hard question. That comparison is graceful, he said, but not true to experience, so consider this. Which is more like what is unseen, unchanging, always itself, the body or the soul? The soul, Simmias answered quietly. And which is more like what is seen, changing, never the same from hour to hour? The body, said Sabos. Then what is akin to the immortal, that which remains is the soul, and what is akin to the mortal, that which dissolves, is the body. When death comes, each goes to what is like itself. The body returns to the earth that shaped it. The soul, polished by a life of truth, goes to what is clear and lasting. If a soul has lived cruelly, desperately attached to hunger and noise, it drifts restlessly, but a soul that has practiced quiet is light enough to rise. Simmias folded his arms, then opened them again, as though embracing and releasing the idea at once. You make it easy to be brave, he said, but the heart shakes for other reasons. We will miss you, and I will miss you, Socrates said, though not in a sorrow that wounds. Love does not end when voices fall silent. It simply changes its clothing. Apollodorus began to cry again, softly this time, like rain against a clay jar. Socrates reached out his hand, and Apollodorus took it, ashamed and comforted at once. Do not accuse yourself for feeling, Socrates said. Tears are not foolish. They are the body's way of honoring what the mind reveres. But let us not drown. Let us look at the water and see through it. A small clatter sounded in the corridor, the guard shifting a jug, then steadying it with care. He lingered by the door, listening. He had heard many men speak before facing death. He had never heard anyone make of the hour a schoolroom where fear was taught to sit quietly. Socrates turned his head slightly, as though noticing the guard without looking at him. Friend, he said toward the doorway, forgive the noise of our thoughts. The guard answered from the shadows, voice rough with respect. It is the quietest noise I have ever heard. They smiled, and the early light moved a finger's breadth across the floor. Time became a gentle thing. They spoke of small matters, how the prison bread had tasted more like clay than wheat, how the oil in the lamp had burned longer than expected. Then Socrates returned to what had brought them close enough to breathe one another's breath. Let us also consider, he said, that virtue is not a trick we play upon ourselves. Courage, moderation, justice, these are not decorations on a life, but the shape of a life well tuned. If the soul were merely a harmony dependent upon the body's strings, how would it command those strings to be moderate? Harmony does not rule the lyre, the musician does. Yet we feel within us a power that instructs appetite to wait, anger to cool, fear to listen. That ruling part is not the music of the body, it is the musician, it is the soul. Simmias lowered his gaze, then raised it again with new steadiness. I see the fault in my own comparison, he admitted. The tune does not chide the player shapes the tune. Sabes remained thoughtful, unwilling to rest simply because the bed looked soft. Still, he said, even a careful weaver outlives many cloaks. Perhaps the soul outlives many bodies, yet finally wears out as well. Socrates looked at him with gratitude. How good it is to have friends who will not let me pass with lazy arguments, he said. Listen, then, not only with the mind, but with the part of you that loves what does not rust. What tires is what resists. What wears out is what is rubbed by time. The soul is not dragged by seasons unless it narrows itself to hunger and heat. When it opens toward what is just and true, it is strengthened, not spent. You know how a candle, when lit from another, does not steal the other's flame? So it is with the soul touched by truth. It does not consume the source, it participates in it. They fell silent. The room felt larger than its walls, as if the horizon had moved inward and taken a seat on the floor. Phaedo spoke at last, voice level, almost serene. Your calm is a kind of teaching I did not expect to learn. It makes me think that the worst we fear is often a story we tell ourselves. When the story is quiet, there is only breath. Socrates gave him a look that was almost playful. You will make a fine philosopher, he said, if you do not forget to be human. The light reached their sandals. Somewhere beyond the prison, cellars would soon lift their shutters, and the city would rub sleep from its eyes. But inside, morning arrived with a gentler hand. Crito, who had been quiet, cleared his throat. If the time comes sooner than we expect, he said, is there anything you would have us do? Affairs to settle? Words to carry to those who could not come? Socrates smiled. Yes, he said. There is a small debt, a cock owed to Asclepius. Remind me before the end, or rather, do not wait to be reminded. See that it is paid. They looked at one another, puzzled and moved. Why a thanks offering to the god of healing at the hour of death? Socrates answered without being asked. All my life I have considered philosophy a medicine, a way to cure the soul of its fever for what passes. If death frees the soul from the illness of confusion, it is a kind of healing, and gratitude is suitable. Apollodorus wiped his face with the back of his hand and laughed through his tears. You make even death reasonable, he said. Not reasonable, Socrates corrected softly. Intelligible, that is enough. They spoke then of earlier days, not to cling, but to bless what had been shared. Socrates remembered a young man who once came to him proud of a speech he had written. He had asked the young man to sing it backward to see whether he loved truth or applause. They all laughed, and the memory shed its sting, leaving only the joy of having been foolish among friends. When the laughter faded, Socrates asked them to consider one more thing. Where does fear hide? He asked. In the body, Apollodorus said at once. In the mind, said Simmias. In the story that ties body to mind, said Sabes cautiously. Socrates nodded. And what loosens that knot? They waited. Attention, he said, not the sharp attention that hunts for mistakes, but the soft attention that watches until lies grow tired of pretending. Attend gently, and fear will fall asleep at your feet. The guard returned then, not entering, only placing his hand on the doorframe, as if to ask permission from the wood. He looked at Socrates, then at the others, and his mouth had the shape of a man deciding whether to speak. Friend, Socrates said, do what you must when the time asks for you. Until then, you are welcome in our silence. The guard nodded and stepped away, leaving behind the faint smell of oil and iron. They rested. No one rushed to fill the hush. It was enough to be together. Socrates closed his eyes, and after a few breaths opened them again, as though waking from a sleep inside waking. Listen, he said, to the small sounds, the city beginning, our own breathing, the lamp still burning though it should have died an hour ago. Let these remind you how easily the world continues when we stop pushing it. He looked from face to face, letting each man feel seen. When I am gone, he said, do not carry me as a weight. Carry me as a question. Ask it gently, ask it often, and let your lives answer. Apollodorus pressed his lips together and managed not to cry. Simmias set his palm to his chest, surprised at how steady his heart had become. Sabes traced a line in the dust with his sandal and smoothed it out again. The sun had now climbed into the room and lay across the stone like a warm animal. Socrates had leaned into the light and breathed in, then out, slowly, fully, peacefully. He spoke once more of the soul, not to prove, but to bless. Whether my arguments persuade you or not, he said, live as if the soul were worth guarding. Train it toward truth, feed it with courage, wash it with kindness. A soul so tended will not fear the dark, because it carries a lamp that does not depend on oil. They listened without interrupting. The words did not land like stones. They drifted down like leaves and came to rest where they were needed. At the threshold of noon, footsteps returned with a different gravity. The guard stepped inside at last, eyes wet, voice careful. Socrates, he said, you know why I've come. Do not be angry with me. I am only the messenger of others' orders. Socrates lifted his hand, not to stop him, but to spare him. I am not angry, he said. You have been gentle. If I had to choose who would bring me the cup, I would choose a man with your face. The guard looked away and nodded quickly. I will give you a little time, he said. When you are ready, call for me. He left them again, and the room exhaled. For a long while no one spoke. When at last Phaedo did, his voice was clear. I am afraid, he admitted, and yet I am not. I do not know how to hold both. Hold them as you hold your hands, Socrates said. Together, not against one another. Let fear rest on the palm of understanding, and it will not claw. Let courage rest on the palm of humility, and it will not strut. This is the way to carry opposites without tearing. Crito stood and adjusted the cloak over Socrates' shoulders, an old habit that felt like a blessing. The cloth smelled faintly of smoke and wool. Socrates thanked him with a nod that contained a lifetime. Before they return, he said, remember the small debt. A cock to Asclepius. Do not forget. And remember something else. The soul is not harmed by what the world does to the body. It is harmed by what it consents to in itself. Keep your consent for what is just, and you will not be wounded by what happens. They promised, each in his own way. Simmias with a hand on his heart, Sabes with an incline of the head, Apollodorus with a whispered yes that shook the air. Socrates rose slowly, as though standing into a new skin. He tested his steps, not because he doubted his strength, but because he loved the floor that had carried him this far. He looked once more toward the window. The sky beyond was a blue so calm it did not need a word. Call him, he said quietly. It is time. Phaedo moved to the door and spoke the guard's name with respect. They heard vessels being lifted, a cup poured, the hushed exchange of duty and regret. Then the guard returned, holding a small bowl as one holds a sleeping bird. He would have looked away, but Socrates' gaze asked him to stay. Come, the philosopher said, be with us. A hard task is lighter when shared. The guard nodded. He explained what the herb would do and how Socrates should walk a little after drinking. His voice broke on the last word, and he fell silent. Socrates took the cup. His fingers rested a moment against the rim, warm against clay. He turned to his friends, and the room gathered itself around him like a cloak. Do not let your love become a chain, he said. Let it become a path. He raised the cup to his lips and paused only to breathe. Then he drank, slowly, as if honoring the bitterness by not hurrying through it. When it was done, he handed the empty bowl back to the guard, who received it as though it might burn through his hands. Socrates stood and began to walk, one slow circle around the lamp, another toward the window, another back again, until the guard asked him to sit. The friends gathered closer, not crowding, only near enough to share breath. Socrates' face was untroubled. He seemed to be listening to something that could be heard only from within. Remember, he said softly, the debt. Crito answered at once. It will be paid. A coolness crept upward from the feet, as the guard had said it would. Socrates noticed it, as he noticed everything without story or complaint. He placed his hand on his thigh and felt the quiet there, then higher, to the place where sensation still spoke. Gentle, he whispered. Let us be gentle. The room leaned into silence. Words grew fewer, then stopped altogether. Socrates breathed, in, out, the simplest lesson and the last. His eyes moved to the light on the floor, then to his friends, then to no place at all that could be named. Phaedo would later say he had never seen a man meet death so easily. But in that moment there were no comparisons, only presence. The coolness reached the chest. The breath grew lighter, not strangled, only distant, as if returning to a shore it recognized. Socrates' lips parted. If it is nothing, then there is nothing to fear, and if it is something, then I go to good company. A faint smile moved across his mouth and vanished like a ripple. The guard touched his shoulder with reverence. Crito leaned in to hear what could no longer be spoken. Apollodorus put his face in his hands, and did not cry out. Simmias and Sebes stood as if witnessing a temple open. Socrates breathed once more, in and out, and the room did not end. It simply grew deeper. For a long while after the last breath, no one moved. The light on the floor did not know what had changed, but the men in the room knew and stood inside the change the way one stands inside weather, accepting what the sky has decided. Phaedo was the first to straighten, though his knees trembled as he did. He looked upon the face he had studied for years, a face that had so often turned toward him with questions, kindness, the quiet mischief of a teacher who trusts his students to find their own answers. Now it gazed nowhere and everywhere at once, calm, unhurried, beyond. The guard took the empty cup and set it near the wall, as carefully as if it still contained something living. He folded his hands, bowed his head, and stepped back into the corridor, where shadow received him like water receives a stone. Crito leaned close, listening for anything left to hear. He placed two fingers lightly at the throat, not to challenge the truth, only to greet it. When he withdrew his hand, he covered Socrates' chest with the cloak, smoothing the cloth as a father might smooth the blanket of a sleeping child. Apollodorus's shoulders shook, yet no loud sound escaped him. He had promised himself not to break the stillness, and he honored that promise now, tears moving down, breath moving through, grief learning its manners in the company of peace. The Simmias stood very straight, as if he had been appointed guardian of the moment. Sebes stared at his own open palms, then slowly closed them, then opened them again, and found that the gesture calmed him, like waves that keep arriving without asking permission. Phaedo spoke at last, not to command, not to interpret, but to hold the group together with a thread of voice. He asked that the offering be paid. He said softly, "We will see it done." Crito nodded. Before all else, he drew a careful breath. "Friends, we must also ask the jailer what customs the city requires of us. We owe Socrates what is fitting." From the doorway, the guard answered as if the cell itself had learned to speak. "You may remain," he said, "as long as you wish. When you depart, inform the porter, and the rights will be respected. The city is not cruel to the quiet." They thanked him with their eyes. He withdrew again, not far, never far, a witness who chose humility over presence. For a time they remembered aloud, not to drag the past into the room, but to let it sit beside them and behave itself. They told small stories, the time Socrates pretended not to hear a clever boast until the boast had shrunk to a manageable size, the day he bought stale bread because it would force a hungry man to chew slowly and think about gratitude, the way he would stop mid-step to admire a ray of light across a wall, as if a god had signed his name there. In those memories his voice returned, gentle and teasing, exact, and then faded again, until the sound of their own breathing became the most trustworthy thing. Sun filled the cell with a warmer shade, the lamp finally admitting that its work was done. Phaedo stood and went to the window. From there he could see a sliver of the street, white with morning, and the lower branches of an olive tree that belonged to no one and to everyone. He rested his forehead against the bars and closed his eyes. He had thought that despair would burn him hollow. Instead, something steadier gathered inside, not joy, not pride, not triumph, a kind of clean sorrow that did not corrode. When he turned, he found Simmias watching him. Will we ever speak the same way again? Simmias asked. Phaedo understood the question. Perhaps not, he said. Perhaps we will speak more slowly. Thebes approached the bench. He looked at Socrates' hands, the lines, the old scars from tools and winters, the beauty of use. Those hands argued better than many philosophers, he murmured. They lifted water, stroked a child's hair, turned a cup with no hatred in the wrist. Apollodorus knelt and touched the stone. It was not the arguments only, he said. It was the way he listened when we were wrong, as if our error were a bird that must be coaxed to land, not chased into panic. Crito placed his palm gently on Socrates' brow. He once told me, he said, that a city is a conversation that never ends. If that is true, then his words have not ceased. They have only changed speakers. They fell silent again, not from poverty of thought, but from respect for it. The moments lengthened, the way a shadow lengthens as the sun thinks about noon. At last, Crito asked what all had been avoiding. Shall we move him? Phaedo looked to the guard, who nodded permission. Simmias and Sebas stepped forward. Together with Crito, they lifted and arranged the body as the law would have it. Not as a thing, not as a relic, but as the last labor of love. When it was done, they sat once more. No one felt the need to make a final speech. The hour itself had spoken clearly enough. Phaedo remembered a sentence from the previous day, when they had still believed there might be more days. Socrates had said, almost in passing, that the soul is not owned, so it is loaned. It returns, like he had added, to what lends it. The thought settled over Phaedo now like a cloak placed by a careful hand. He said aloud what each man had been repeating inside himself. We should go to the temple, he whispered. We should do as he asked. Crito stood, grateful for a task. Simmias and Sabes nodded. Apollodorus wiped his face and managed a thin, honest smile, the kind that hurts and heals in the same breath. They told the guard they would return and bring what was needed for the rites. He bowed, not a soldier's bow, not a servant's, a human bow. When they stepped into the corridor, the air changed. The stone carried the cool of places where many footsteps have learned to be quiet. Outside, the city's voice rose, not loud, not soft, the ordinary music of a morning that had not read the news. On the steps, Apollodorus hesitated and looked back. Phaedo touched his shoulder. He is not there only, Phaedo said. He is in the next true sentence we speak. They walked. Athens opened around them, stalls setting out figs and jars, women calling to one another from doorways, a boy chasing a dog that was not his and was entirely his. The world had the good manners not to stop. At the temple they arranged the offering, a cock for Asclepius, the humble bird that wakes a sleeping city, given in thanks for a different kind of waking. The priest did not ask questions. He recognized a certain quiet in the eyes of men who had stood in a room where breath had become instruction. They left the coin and the bird and the promise, and then they wandered without choosing a street. Phaedo spoke little. Simmias and Sabes tested the morning air with a kind of silence that tries out its new shape. Crito attended to the errands of death, words to a family friend, a message to be delivered to a son, the naming of a time, the choosing of simple cloth. By midday, the heat pressed thoughtfully upon their shoulders. They found a patch of shade where a plane tree reached wide, and there they sat, not to sink, but to hold one another up without touching. I am surprised by what is absent, Simmias said at last. I expected fear to return like a creditor. It has not. Perhaps fear has learned gratitude, Sabes said. Perhaps it has been given a seat and fed, and now it no longer claws. Crito drew a line in the dust with a stick and left it unfinished. Yes. He taught us to live inside questions without breaking them, he said. We can do that now, for a time. Phaedo smiled in a way that had nothing to do with lips. What I will carry, he said, is not his certainty. It is his method, the way he asked us to walk around an idea as around a well, testing the ground, listening for the hollow place that might give way, not to shame us, but to keep us from falling. Apollodorus lifted his face to the leaves and closed his eyes. The city sounds kinder today, he said. No one contradicted him. Perhaps grief had opened an extra door in the ear, a door through which mercy slips without knocking. The afternoon passed like a slow oar across a large lake. They spoke, rested, rose, arranged, returned. What needed to be done was done without hurry, as if the tasks themselves understood that haste would be disrespect. Toward evening, a soft breeze walked up from the sea, carrying the faint salt of words spoken by fishermen to waves. The friends returned at last to the place where they had begun. The jailer met them with a look that admitted he had been guarding more than a cell. Inside, the room felt newly simple, stone, light, the outline of a bench. The body lay as they had left it, composed, obedient to the law of final stillness. Crito moved with the steadiness of a man who has chosen to be useful. He adjusted the cloth again, spoke a few simple words that needed no grandness, and then stepped aside. Simmias and Sabes drew nearer, not to study, not to analyze, but to pay the last tax owed by love, attention without demand. Apollodorus touched his forehead to the wall. Phaedo placed his hand briefly upon the bench and felt, through the wood, a memory of warmth. He looked at the faces of his friends and recognized in each of them a gentler version of the morning's grief. The rawness had not vanished. It had learned to breathe. We'll write what happened, Phaedo said suddenly, not as a monument, but as a bridge. Others will need to cross. Words can hold the weight if we place them carefully. Crito nodded. Write, but write as he would, with kindness toward the reader. Simmias smiled, and with questions, Cebes added, and with pauses. Apollodorus finally let out the small sound that had been traveling in circles inside his chest. Not a cry, not a sob, a release, like a knot remembering it was only rope. They stood together a while longer, until the first lamps began to appear in the city beyond, stars that had learned to live close to the ground. Then they turned to go. At the threshold, Phaedo looked back one last time. He did not say farewell. The word felt unsuitable for a man who had taught them to consider death a kind of instruction. Instead, he whispered what he would later write, and what others would later read, that among those he had known, this man was the wisest, the most just, and the best. They stepped into the corridor, into the yard, into the evening, and Athens received them as it receives all who return from the edge of things, with bread to be broken, water to be drawn, streets to be walked, and a sky that keeps its promises. As they went, the conversation resumed, not loudly, not hurriedly. They spoke as they had been taught to speak, not to win, not to dazzle, but to discover one another again inside the same old questions. What is good? What is true? What is worth the little time we are given? The night gathered above them. They did not lower their voices to greet it. They let it lower itself over their shoulders like a shawl that remembers the body it warms. And in houses and alleys and quiet courtyards, in the sleeping minds of children who would one day learn to ask why, the city continued its endless lesson. A lamp in one window, a hand on a door, a breath becoming two, and then one, and then two again. The friends parted by twos and threes until Phaedo walked alone. He did not rush. His steps found the pace of thought, and thought found the pace of mercy. At his door he paused and lifted his eyes. The stars had taken their places, familiar, patient, unastonished by any of this. He entered, lit his small lamp, and laid out the tools of speech, wax, stylus, a space on the table cleared of everything but intention. He lowered himself to the stool and waited until his breath and the flame agreed with one another. Then he began to write, slowly, with pauses that would teach future readers how to breathe. He wrote of the night and the morning, of questions asked without vanity, of answers offered without pride. He wrote of the cup and the hand that took it without trembling. He wrote of the debt to Asclepius and the feeling of a room that had grown wider than any room. He wrote the silence too, as best a man can, with spaces where words refused to be greater than what they pointed toward. When he finished the first page, he sat back and closed his eyes. He could hear the city like an ocean sleeping against its shore. He whispered gratitude to his friends, to the teacher who had loved their minds enough to free them, to the unknown reader who would one day sit where he now sat and decide not to be afraid. He dipped the stylus again and continued. Outside, a stray dog barked once and made peace with the darkness. The lamp breathed. Phaedo breathed, so Athens breathed. And somewhere beyond even that, in the place where breath is not counted, a lesson continued without ending, quiet as light upon a wall. The cell was quiet, bathed in a dim amber glow that slipped through the small barred window. Dust drifted lazily in the air, caught in the soft light of a setting sun. Outside, the city hummed faintly, distant conversations, footsteps echoing on stone, the murmur of life continuing. Inside, Socrates sat on a low wooden bench, calm as still water. He had spent the day speaking with his friends, not of escape or fear, but of the nature of the soul, of virtue and of truth. Each word carried a strange peace, as if he was already half beyond this world. His companions, though trying to remain composed, could not hide the weight in their eyes. Socrates noticed their sadness, and with a gentle smile said, "Why do you grieve? You fear what you do not know. Death may be the greatest gift the gods can give." His tone was not one of defiance, but of curiosity, a philosopher until the very end. The evening deepened, shadows stretched along the stone walls, and a guard entered quietly holding a cup of hemlock. The room fell silent. The guard looked away, unwilling to meet Socrates' gaze, for even he felt the injustice of what was about to happen. Socrates took the cup without trembling. His students turned their faces away, some covering their eyes. He raised it to his lips and drank slowly without hesitation, as though it were a simple cup of wine shared among friends. Moments passed. He began to feel the numbness in his legs, a cold tide rising within him. He reclined back, supported by Crito, his most loyal companion. With a soft breath, he said, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Do not forget to pay the debt." These were his last words, a final tribute to the god of healing, as if to say that death itself was a kind of cure. The silence that followed was deep and endless. The torchlight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to bow in respect. When his body finally stilled, the air carried an almost sacred calm, not of sorrow, but of acceptance. Outside, Athens continued its restless rhythm, unaware that one of its greatest minds had just departed. But within those small stone walls, a stillness lingered, the kind of stillness that stays, quietly shaping the hearts of those who witnessed it, echoing through generations long after the moment has passed. When Socrates' body was carried away, Athens felt different. The air was heavy, as though the city itself was holding its breath. The streets that once echoed with the sound of debate and laughter now seemed quieter, slower, as if the soul of the city had dimmed. His followers wandered the familiar roads, their hearts heavy with confusion. Some spoke of injustice, others of fate, but all carried the same feeling, a strange emptiness, as though the world had lost something irreplaceable. In the small courtyards and shaded markets, people whispered about what had happened. Some said the city had rid itself of a troublemaker, a man who questioned too much. Others mourned him quietly, knowing that Athens had silenced its own conscience. His words still floated in the air, invisible but unforgotten. Plato, young and thoughtful, sat for hours by the edge of the agora where he once listened to his teacher speak. He remembered the calmness in Socrates' eyes, the way he questioned everything not to destroy belief, but to rebuild it stronger, purer. It was there that Plato decided the search for truth would not die with his master. He began to write, to capture the spirit of the man who refused to be silenced. At night, when the city fell asleep, a soft wind moved through the Acropolis. It whispered along the marble steps, down to the prison where Socrates had taken his last breath. The place no longer felt like a cell, it felt like a shrine. Some say that philosophy itself began again in those quiet nights. The courage to question, to seek meaning, to live by reason, all of it found new life in the hearts of those who had watched him face death without fear. Years passed, and Athens changed. Empires rose and fell, but the name of Socrates endured. He became more than a man, he became a voice, a reminder that truth lives not in wealth or power, but in the soul that dares to ask why. Even centuries later, people would speak of him not with sorrow, but with gratitude, because through his calm acceptance of death, he taught the living how to live with honesty, courage, and peace. And somewhere in the quiet between thoughts, his voice still lingers. Not loud or commanding, but gentle, asking each of us the same question he once asked his students: what is a good life? In that question, his spirit continues. And in the stillness of the night, when the world slows down and the noise fades away, his wisdom returns, as soft as a whisper, reminding us that even in silence, the search for truth never ends.